Hello, I'm Father Hugh Mackenzie. I'm a priest at Westminster Cathedral in London. And with my colleague here, Jack, we are philosophy students, postgraduate, and also we are leading a discussion group on phenomenology. And recently we've been discussing Edith Stein, and we're making a video just to overview her book, Finite and Eternal Being. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Father. Thank you for having me. I'm a recent philosophy graduate where I was looking at Kant, and that naturally led to my interest in phenomenology. So we've had some great discussions over the last year or so with our small group. So we'll see what we make of Edith Stein.
Lovely. So Edith Stein lived and studied in the 20s and 30s, and then tragically she was killed in Auschwitz, murdered there. She was an assistant of Edmund Husserl, the founder of the modern school of phenomenology. And at that point, for some of that time, she was an atheist, and then she ended up as a Catholic in the 20s, and then joined the Carmelites in the early 30s, I think it was, and wrote this book in 1934-35, Finite and Eternal Being. We have the cover at the top right. In that book, because she was now a Catholic and had a great reverence for the great Catholic philosopher and theologian St Thomas Aquinas, she wanted to try and synthesize the two. So there are three more parts to this video. In a moment, we're going to introduce phenomenology, then we're going to introduce scholasticism, and then finally, we're going to look at how Edith Stein attempts in this book to synthesize the two. Okay, so first, just to introduce phenomenology a little bit with the help of a professor, Professor McNamara from Steubenville University in the United States. And he's also an expert on Edith Stein and has been helping us with our phenomenology discussion group. This was him on the Pints with Aquinas podcast with Matt Fradd.
Well, you could basically set it as the study or science of phenomena. And what are phenomena? They're the elements of experience. Mm-hmm. And so phenomenology closely attends to conscious experience in an effort to unpack its contents and therefore give us reality at its most refined, comprehensive, and clear. And so it's in a way to return to the things themselves as we experience them and not leave anything behind.
And talk about why that was necessary given Hume and Kant and where people were at.
So various different philosophical schools or traditions had developed by this point. Empiricism would be one, British empiricism, or Kantian, which would be an understanding that the mind brings to reality most of what's given in our experience. Empiricism, there would be a sense that we, in the mind, represent reality, like we have an image of reality. And phenomenology, in a way, seeks to answer both of these ways of thinking about how we come to know by speaking about the intentionality of the mind. So our cognitive faculties are ordered towards the world in an intentional way. That is, our mind is about the world or of the world.
Right. I would just highlight something important I think Dr. McNamara's done there before we look at him putting it in a slightly different way in a moment. In the light of the fact that we're about to talk about scholasticism, I just want to re-emphasize that he has made it clear that this phrase of Husserl saying back to the things themselves is not back to empiricism, and it's not back to representationalism. And so it's not back to saying that the intelligibility of an object as it's given to me can be exhausted without referring to the knower. Rather, as he said, it's a sort of middle way between empiricism and Kantianism. That is to say that if scholasticism, well discovered and acknowledged that there's no intelligibility of an individual thing without its context, without its relationship with other things, which they captured through the form, which was a universal dimension of something. That is to say, it was something shared by an individual which connected it with something else, with its context. So the universal horse. was something which connected one horse to another horse, but it was true of each horse. But that relationality between things out there is an abstraction from the fuller, richer understanding, which, as Dr. McNamara says, does not leave anything behind, which includes, therefore, and indeed in some sense from our angle is rooted in the impact it has upon me, the meaning for the observer, the use maybe that I can make of it, its potentiality for me. And whilst it's going to be very good that we let go of that relationship with the subject in order to do things like science, science is something which does leave things behind, in McNamara's phrase. That is to say, it leaves behind that richer, more foundational dimension of the essence of objects. And of course, this is not to deny that objects are distinct from us. It's really just to say that distinction is at its heart a relationship with that with which it's distinct. So we'll just look at Dr. McNamara saying this in a slightly different way, again, slightly later in this interview.
There tends to be in contemporary thought a mind-world problem and a mind-body problem, and both of these problems are in some way coordinate with one another. And in different ways, Kantian philosophy would propose this problem. You have the mind and its phenomena, but the noumenal world we know nothing of. And empiricism, in a way, has a tendency to divide us from the world, because what we know are the representations we have of the things, and so we don't really have direct access. Well, if we focus on conscious experience, we see that it's actually given very differently than this. What we have is me as a conscious subject experiencing acts of consciousness with objects of the world given in those acts of consciousness. And so there's a kind of holistic unity to that. We can abstract consciousness or its acts or the objects, but really what we have is a unified experience. I am conscious of this wonderful Pints with Aquinas mug and its contents.
However you pronounce that.
Yeah, well, I won't try. Some beer. And that's really what we have given in experience. And if all of our knowledge is based upon experience, as it was for Aquinas and Aristotle, then we have to tend again to experience. And so one could think of the phenomenological school or movement as a way of attending to reality. And so the phenomenological philosopher leaves behind the natural attitude, enters into the phenomenological attitude.
Just to highlight that these technical terms, natural attitude and phenomenological attitude, and their contrast is quite important, but does have a somewhat technical meaning, because for Husserl, the natural attitude is that which really in our representationalist culture, we tend to think is the obvious and the primary dimension of an object. That is to say, its clear-cut definition or formal essence in the scholastic terms, or the scientific specification of its relationships with other objects that are out there, is what is real. And of course, what Husserl and the phenomenologists are doing is saying, well, no, that there's something deeper than that which roots it, which is the phenomenological attitude, which takes account of its impact, its meaning, its functionality upon the observer. And this attitude, because it's prior and founding the natural attitude, is something that lets go for a moment of our scientific theories or our claim to define what the essence of something is, completely irrespective of its relationship with mind and observation, and get back to the things themselves. That is to say, the things as they are experienced, that holistic unity Dr. McNamara talks about, of a distinct object having an impact and almost an invitation upon the ethical subject.
So, Jack, did you want to say anything else about what phenomenology is, based on what I've just said?
Yeah, it's, one of its characteristics is trying to bridge the gap between the subject and the object. And so they had this idea of intentionality that they got from Husserl, So you never get the isolated sense datum. You never get the isolated object. You intend it under a certain aspect. You look at it in a certain way. You desire it for a certain purpose, whatever it may be. And this relation is, we would argue, indissoluble. And it's sort of the basis for overcoming a mind-body dualism, or subject-object dualism, or radical separation, where we can't advance our knowledge because the things in themselves are forever beyond us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lovely. We will move on to our section 3 here. This on the scholastic ontology and epistemology. Scholastic comes from the word for schools, which refers to the beginnings of the universities in the sort of early second millennium. And Thomas Aquinas was one of the sort of founders, I suppose, of the Catholic scholastic movement. And they had an ontology and an epistemology, that is to say, a description of objects. So we're sort of stepping back a bit, really, from what we've just described, just to look at how they described objects a little bit, and then how they described us knowing the objects. So, as we said, really, the knowing sort of came second, whereas in phenomenology, they're going to try and put the two together. And Edith Stein's going to try and do that in a scholastic manner. So I have here a PowerPoint.
So we start with the perennial problem of universality. If you're going to be a realist, if you're going to claim that human language captures truth, and if you don't, you've got other problems, significant problems, then you need to deal with the problem of universality, because there is no intelligibility to particulars without their properties, which reveal them and describe them. And their properties are repeatable. Something can be blue on this side of the universe and 1 million years ago. Something can be square, or something can fly, or something can be a bird, and it's truly a bird now, as the bird which is a bird 100 years ago was a bird. So I already highlighted in the introduction to phenomenology how phenomenology and scholasticism have different starting points with regard to the relationship of the mind to the object of knowledge. And that is to say that phenomenology sees it as intrinsic to the essence of what is known. That is to say, we go back to the things themselves by focusing on the essence and leaving to a little bit later the theories about the purely objective realm, such as the scientific theories. Whereas scholasticism tends to put that a little bit later and focuses first on trying to solve the problem of universality as it applies to the objective realm, irrespective of the subjective, which is brought in later. So Edith Stein is trying to synthesize these two visions. They both do recognize the role of the mind, actually, in solving universality for the realistic tradition, because, just as I said just now, a star is a star today and a star 1 million years ago, and yet they're both truly stars for the realist. It does seem that the mind has to be involved, but as I say, the mind is involved by phenomenologists right at the beginning, whereas only in a secondary place by the scholastics and Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And that does cause them problems. Let's look then at that before coming back to phenomenology, particularly Edith Stein's synthesis. And so we have here in this text, let us read out, individual things due to similarities of their observable properties are members of universal classes, such as species, described by the universal term. We see more than one four-legged creature with a mane jumping over fences. These repeated properties make us recognize the class of horses. That's the universal term. And we conclude, Red Rum is a horse, Shergar is a horse. Here indeed is a lot of horses there. So these statements about Red Rum and Shergar are true statements. If that's Red Rum and that's Shergar, they are both truly horses, and yet they're different. So again, these are true statements. Red Rum is not Shergar, but horse refers to one thing. So does mane. They are universal terms. Realism asks, what is this thing? And just to make this even more concrete, Bucephalus was Alexander's horse. Marengo was the horse of Napoleon. Being a distinct individual horse implies something beyond the distinction, something univocally shared. Now that's true for all, and now we start to look at the solution of scholasticism, and that is to say there is an object which is horseness, and it is universal in the mind, but it does apply to both the horses we're talking about here.
We sense the individual horses, but we abstract into the mind the form of the horse.
So there is the horseness, which is in the mind, and as we're going to see, the object of the active intellect, and yet it also applies to the objective individual things. It is particularized in Bucephalus, and it is particularized in Marengo, and yet somehow it's the same thing. You might say, well, that doesn't quite solve the problem, does it, in terms of the realistic application of a univocal concept to two different things? Has it really solved the problem? Well, it's called moderate realism for that reason.
This universal thing truly applies to the individual thing. So the individuals are truly horses, and that would be realism. It was called moderate realism because you needed to invoke the mind almost in a proto-phenomenological way to capture the univocicity of that which is in two things that are fundamentally distinct as objects of sensation.
The universality is objective, and yet the purely universal object is something in the mind. But at least it did handle nominalism, which was the big competitor of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century Paris. They were beginning to say already then, horseness is purely a creation of the mind. Only individuals objectively exist. Well, that's not going to be realist. It's not going to defend something like human nature, which is crucial for Christianity, but it's not going to defend the objectivity of any intelligibility, really. But however, both nominalism and this moderate realism of the scholasticism both rejected idealism. For instance, the Platonist position that horseness is the only real reality. Individuals actually are illusory. So there's Bucephalus and there's Marengo, both actually just illusions in the mind. That which really exists is the form of horse. Thomistic Realism affirms that Bucephalus was a horse. Individuals instantiate horseness. Therefore, Marengo was a horse, both in different eras across time, but they were truly horses. And when you say that one is a horse and another is a horse, there is a certain univocicity there. There may be an analogical use of the word as well, but there is actually, they both were truly horses for this realism that we're trying to defend. They both truly have the nature of horse in a particularized way.
Okay, so Thomism on universality, observed property similarity comes from individual things. Actual participation in a non-visible universal form, like horseness. Material individuals engage through their properties, but are actually participating in a substantial form individuated by matter. There is the form of horse, and each individual horse up here is participating in that. That's their ontology. And there's an acorn, even a little acorn has the form of oak tree in it already, which is also in the full-grown oak tree, but that is somehow the form is quite close to an end as well, a telos, a final object. The acorn is oriented towards being the fullness of the form.
So we now come to ask, what is the epistemology of this? How did the Aristotelian, Thomas, and the scholastics explain this process of knowing? Because they are moving away maybe from the Augustinian immediate intuition, which is really closer to the phenomenological claim that there's a unity between mind and world through their fundamental and mutually intrinsic relationship between subject and distinct object. It's all a little bit simpler, but the ontological solution that the scholastics were trying to achieve led to this somewhat cumbersome view of exactly how it happens, how we abstract universality, and yet still that universal form is not the object of our knowing, because they want to be realists. They want to be able to say that somehow the universality, which is abstracted into the mind, is not the object. The object of our universal knowing is the particular. This is the whole point of realism. So this led to this somewhat cumbersome structure. And this is how I was taught it in Rome. This is somewhat of a caricature, but it's useful. That in some sense, the imagination is a little bit like a TV screen. And when it sees an individual horse, it gets what's called the phantasm onto the screen. And the intellect is then able to, as it were, work upon the phantasm by, in a somewhat Augustinian sense, shining a light. Not so much at this stage on the actual object, which it was for Augustine, and it is through the concept of intentionality for the phenomenologists, but rather upon the phantasm. And this active intellect shines a light upon it, as it were. And the form, the universal form of the horse, falls upon the passive intellect, and it now has that shape or nature of the individual thing impressed upon the passive intellect, species impressor, which is then going to be referred back through the phantasm to the actual individual objective horse that we're looking at, and is as it were on the screen, but actually we're referring back now to the objective individual. And therefore we are able to claim that this universality in an individualized way is actually the object of our knowing. Of course, what individualized universality is still not actually explained, which was the whole problem to start with, you might say. Indeed, sometimes the word, in a slightly Platonic way, participation of the individual in the universal form was used. It's a very old concept going right back, as I say, to Plato, but Plato didn't explain what it is. But there we have all of these individual horses now, all participate in the universal form. Universal form, though, is not a Platonic form. It's something that is only universal in the mind, but it's particularized in the individual. This is why it was called moderate realism.
Did you want to add anything to my little overview of Thomistic ontology and epistemology there, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just worth noting some of the difficulties with it. For me, it's always been this idea that the only thing you know is universals. You have what the intellect abstracts, properly speaking, is the universal term, and what it applies back to particulars is the universal term. And for me, that just suggests that there's no way to the particular, which seems very counterintuitive, because I do have relations with particular things in a species which are different to the other members of that species because they're mine, or because I have a certain sentimental value that I attribute to them, or whatever that might be.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, I agree. So when you touch someone or something, really, you were touching the accidents of it, or you were sensing the thing. It was a real touch, but you couldn't say you were that the touch in any sense was not intrinsic to the knowing. The knowing, the role of the intellect was to grasp the universal side. Then there was this flip back to the phantasm. So I suppose you could say there's a sort of referring to the individual, but the individual wasn't really known. Yeah. Any other points?
Yeah. Yeah, so just what you're saying there sounds like it's like a separation of sort and sensation, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Universal and individual was form and matter were metaphysically distinction. They were regarded as metaphysical principles.
Yeah.
Really
Whereas
form
Edith
matter.
Stein has this line we quite enjoyed in her original essay that she wrote under Husserl: "Touch me, I am what I seem to be," which sort of
Yeah,
challenges
yeah,
that very distinction.
yes, yes, indeed,
It's a
indeed.
good way to think of phenomenology.
Lovely, lovely, great, thank you. Okay, so let's just move on now to first an overview of what we think from our group, with the help of Professor McNamara. The Edith Stein is saying in Finite and Eternal Being. Okay, and I've produced this diagram, and what we have here, and feel free to come in, Jack, on this, but a key concept I think we're all acknowledging for Edith Stein is essentiality. Now that's related to what form is in the scholasticism we just looked at. However, it's not. Sometimes she seems to talk of it as something which is universal, but sometimes it's beyond that. But and it's certainly not individual, but it certainly is abstract. It's something that she sees us as intuiting, I think, when we have knowledge of things and our cognitive faculties are working. So when we're looking at various horses, she acknowledges we get something like hoarseness, but essentiality is something a little bit less than form. Is that right, Jack? I mean, how would you like to define what essentiality is?
Yeah, so essentiality advances upon scholastic form in the sense that it is trying to better integrate knowledge with your lived experience of knowing, which is much more dynamic. It's much more progressive. So I don't. It doesn't seem right to say that I have a pure apprehension of the form of something, because I seem to be able to return to these objects and discover more in them. There's a kind of inexhaustible intelligibility to sense experience, and so what was very important for Stein was the individual existence, which carries the essence in the thing in your diagram, and your mentalization of that, I guess, is tending towards the essentiality, which through what she describes, acts of unfolding. So mentalization is the act of unfolding the essentiality, but the essentiality itself is kind of a limit case to that process of discovery, of trying to distill the essence of the individual existence. So there's a double function here, which is why we have arrows going up and down. On the one hand, essentiality is the ground for all being of a certain kind. On the other hand, it's an epistemological limit case.
Yeah,
and this wasn't quite how form was treated in scholasticism, I don't think.
Yeah, although interestingly, Dr. McNamara was not against us using the example of hoarseness for essentiality, but his preferred example was triangularity, if I'm right. Is that?
Yeah, you mentioned.
He particularly wanted to say that, well, there's something called triangularity, that irrespective, in a sense, of whether we experience triangles, it exists, and it's in its sort of perfect form. It's clear cut, but possibly never really exists in its perfect form, possibly. And yet, through our experience of approximately geometrical shapes in all our experience, we can discern the ideal. So it is a sort of ideal version of the scholastic form, I think, as you've just said. But the dotted sort of purple lines, we put mentalization in purple here. is partly what you described as the unfolding. But just to slip back to the ontology, which particularly in Red, you have this actualization, which is quite like what Thomas Aquinas saw happening to the abstract essence, which was form and matter, through the act of existence, becoming an actual individual thing. And then it was the act of existence for Thomas that distinguished between an abstract or an imagined Shergar, the horse, and actual Shergar was the act of existence. But she's doing something slightly different here, which is the triangularity. If you find an actual triangle, something which is actually triangular, like a Toblerone chocolate piece, then it's actually been actualized somehow, and it has the essence of triangle now actually actualized. You can actually call it an essence, and that is the Red. When we come to mentalize, when we come to conceptualize the essence, to grasp that form in our head, which was an abstraction for the scholastics, then we are doing something similar, she says, to actualization. When we actually know it, we are actually in a relationship with the essence, which is analogous to its actualization. Is that how you would see that purple and red line that I've drawn there at the bottom right?
Yeah, I think there is a symmetry between actualization and mentalization. I mean, one of the important things with actualization is that it admits of degrees. So, you know, you find imperfectly triangular things, but in their own way, they are still actualizing the essentiality, just not as perfectly as the Toblerone thing does. You know, for instance, being this mentalization thing. I think it's the same because that pure essentiality is becoming clearer as we experience more triangular things, maybe. I mean, the triangle, the geometric examples are a bit shallow for this because we all do seem to have a pure intuition for geometry. But you can imagine. I mean, she also really likes the example of joy, for instance, and I think there's something a bit more to joy, for instance. There's always this capacity to discover deeper joy, I would say, and you recognize that in relation to some kind of perfection, let's say.
Thank you. And then we have this blue line here, which is a sense that once you have the actualization of the essence in the thing, then it is aiming towards its perfection. Even in its ontology, there is an orientation of the Toblerone or the horse towards the essentiality of horseness or triangularity. A bit like a sort of participation in the form, which was something that I think the scholastics had a little bit of. I think she does use the word participation for the sense that the essence is an actualization of the essentiality and is still dynamically participating in essentiality. Everything's dynamic in her ontology. There's nothing really static here. Would that be right of the dark blue line? Do you think there's the sort of orientation of the horse towards the essentiality of horseness?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sort of the reciprocal function from actualization. So if it has been actualized, then it also follows that there is this participation, and that's something that's very intimately connected to knowing, because when you know it, when you know the object, you are increasingly participating in the essentiality.
So that's why we have this left-hand arrow here, which is both blue to capture participation and purple to capture mentalization.
Yeah.
Again, there's this sort of certain symmetry going on here. And phenomenologically, we have something like, mentalization is no longer just an add-on to this type of stuff, the red and the blue line here, which is somewhat similar to Thomistic ontology. But what she's tried to do here is really root it all in mentalization and recognize that we wouldn't anyway have knowledge of the essence of things without knowing them, but more than that, the essence of things wouldn't be what they are without the cognitive process of knowing. Would you agree with that maybe in a sense this down arrow here and this up arrow here are contextualize the other two arrows rather than the other way around for Edith Stein?
Which one are you pointing at? Sorry.
So the mentalization bits, the bits with purple, that's this here, that's purple and red, and that's purple and blue. Those two,
right,
are at least of equal existential and metaphysical value as the pure blue and the pure red lines for Edith Stein, that she's trying to capture something at the very least holistic. In Professor McNamara's introduction to phenomenology, he was saying that there's a holism about the objects and the acts of consciousness and the consciousness itself, and the purple bits are not secondary things as they were for scholasticism.
I think it's possible to interpret Stein this way. I think partly because of this idea that the essentiality unfolds in, or did you describe it as meaningful acts of being or something like this? The meaning of being is unfolding before us, and so this seems to put well, it certainly does integrate the subject much more into the picture. Almost seems to put that unfolding as intrinsic to essentiality.
Yes, I like that. I think, as you say, it's a way of interpreting her, but I think that's why it could be called a phenomenology. And obviously, at the end of the day, she's going to try and bring God in as well in those later chapters to grounding this whole dynamic. We better round off there at the moment. I think. Thanks very much for the discussion. It's very, very helpful.
Thank you, Father.
And I shall now say au revoir. Bye bye.
Thank you for watching. A key question then is, does this improve Aquinas' moderate realism? Phenomenology claims to do better on the connection between mind and the world, which was a weakness within the pre-modern science, scholastic philosophy. What exactly is the connection between the universal form in the mind and that out there? They sometimes had to talk of a different realm of being. In one realm of being, they're the same. In another realm of being, they are different because it's only really universal in the mind. But phenomenology, by, as I pointed out, bringing actuated intelligibility into the essence of the object, and as Jack pointed out, by just being true about the subject-object relationship, does seem to offer a way forward. So the question is, has Edith Stein's St. Benedicta of the Cross, has her development and synthesis of Husserl and Aquinas improved Aquinas' moderate realism and even made it a straightforward realism?